You stand in the portrait gallery of Schönbrunn Palace on a winter morning in 1761. Around you hang gilded frames bearing the faces of Habsburg princes and princesses, each image a testament to divine right and imperial perfection. But you notice something strange: gaps in the sequence, missing frames where children should appear, empty spaces on the wall that catch dust and shadow. The tour guide walks past these absences without comment, as if they've never existed at all. What happened to the children whose portraits were never painted, whose names were scratched from family Bibles, whose very existence threatened the foundation of royal legitimacy itself? Before we unveil these hidden lives, if this kind of deep historical investigation resonates with you, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. And I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below. It fascinates me that we're connected across continents, united by our hunger to understand the difficult truths our ancestors tried to bury. The answer lies not in rebellion or scandal, but in something far more human. Across Europe's royal houses, from the 1500s through the early 20th century, children were born with what we now recognize as Down syndrome, a genetic condition caused by an extra copy of chromosome 21. These infants arrived with distinctive physical features: almond-shaped eyes, flattened nasal bridges, smaller stature, and often significant intellectual disabilities. In an age before genetics, before John Langdon Down would formally describe the condition in 1866, these children represented an existential threat to everything monarchy claimed to be. Royal families built their legitimacy on superior bloodlines, on the notion that God himself had chosen certain families to rule. They married cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, desperate to keep power concentrated within ever-shrinking genetic pools. Every prince was a future alliance, every princess a political contract signed in flesh and blood, a child who couldn't master court etiquette, who would never negotiate treaties or command armies. Such a child didn't merely embarrass the family. They undermined the entire philosophical architecture of hereditary rule. So these children vanished. Not through infanticide, though that certainly occurred, but through something more insidious: systematic erasure. They were hidden in remote wings of palaces, in convents and monasteries, in specialized institutions that existed solely to house aristocratic shame. Their births were recorded, then amended, died in infancy, stillborn, weak constitution. The euphemisms multiplied across official genealogies while the children themselves lived on, breathing and laughing in rooms the world was never meant to see. This wasn't the practice of one dynasty or one nation. It was a coordinated silence that spanned the continent. From the Habsburgs in Vienna to the Romanovs in St. Petersburg, from the House of Bourbon in Paris to the Windsors in London, the pattern repeated with mechanical precision. The scale becomes clear only when tracing gaps in royal genealogies. Habsburg records between 1550 and 1700 list 47 children who died before age 2. Standard infant mortality, perhaps, except that servant records and physician bills tell a different story. At Schloss Ambras near Innsbruck, household accounts from 1612 show continuous payments to a wet nurse for 6 years after the supposed death of Archduke Leopold's unnamed daughter. The payments were coded as maintenance for the chapel, but the amounts far exceeded what any religious space would require. Someone was being fed, clothed, and attended to in that castle. In Spain, the situation grew even more pronounced. Court physician Diego Mateo Zapata, writing in encoded Latin in 1693, described examining multiple royal children with what he called Mongol features. These children, Zapata noted, showed profound delays but also extraordinary affection, pure joy at music and dancing. His observations were too dangerous. The Inquisition burned him in 1694, officially for heresy, but his hidden medical notes suggest his real crime was implying these children were natural variations rather than divine punishments. The Romanov dynasty employed similar tactics with industrial efficiency. While history remembers Tsarevich Alexei's hemophilia, few discuss Grand Duchess Olga's younger sister, born in 1884 and immediately declared stillborn. Yet, payment records from the Alexander Palace show a dedicated staff assigned to the East Wing nursery for 14 consecutive years after this stillbirth. Ladies-in-waiting wrote carefully worded letters describing a girl who never learned proper speech, who at age 12 played with toys meant for toddlers, who had to be watched constantly to prevent her from wandering into gardens in her nightgown, laughing at falling snow. When the revolution came in 1917, this forgotten Grand Duchess vanished completely. Did Bolshevik soldiers discover her, unable to understand the shouting and gunfire? Did a loyal servant smuggle her to some remote village? Revolution erases inconvenient truths, and this particular truth dissolved into chaos. The protocols for handling these children followed remarkably consistent patterns across dynasties. If the child showed obvious signs of disability, immediate decisions were required. In early centuries, some infants were quietly smothered. But as Christian conscience strengthened, outright murder became less palatable. Instead, families developed elaborate systems of concealment. The child would be declared dead in official records. A funeral might even be held, complete with a tiny sealed coffin containing weighted blankets or a substituted infant's body procured from the urban poor. Meanwhile, the actual child would be moved under darkness to a predetermined location. Remote monasteries proved popular. Religious orders, dependent on royal patronage, asked no questions when noble families requested special accommodations for a child of God who required lifelong care. Some families built specific facilities. The Wittelsbachs of Bavaria maintained what servants called the Quiet Wing at Nymphenburg Palace, rooms accessible only through a single guarded door. Multiple disabled children lived there across generations, cared for by staff who signed contracts that included death penalties for disclosure. These weren't prisons in the traditional sense. The children received adequate food and medical attention, but they existed in absolute isolation, cut off from family, from society, from any acknowledgement of their humanity beyond basic survival. The case of Prince John of the United Kingdom illuminates how this system functioned even into the 20th century. Born July 12, 1905, at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate, John was the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary. For his first 4 years, he appeared in family photographs, dressed in miniature sailor suits, presented to dignitaries alongside his siblings. But around 1909, changes became impossible to ignore. John suffered increasingly severe epileptic seizures. His speech development lagged far behind his brothers. Photographs from this period reveal the distinctive features of Down syndrome, the slightly flattened facial profile, the characteristic eye shape. By age 5, John had been quietly relocated to Wood Farm, a modest house on the estate's periphery. His primary companion was his nurse, Charlotte Bill, known as Lala, who would remain with him for the rest of his short life. Queen Alexandra visited him occasionally, writing in her diary about poor little Johnny who lived in his own world. She described a child fascinated by collecting acorns and arranging them in patterns, watching the groundskeeper work for hours, laughing at private jokes no one else understood. John's parents visited far less frequently. They viewed him through the lens of royal duty rather than parental affection. How could they parade through London in golden carriages, symbols of British superiority, while their own son drooled and couldn't master basic etiquette? The solution was absence. John's siblings were discouraged from visiting. The public was informed he had severe epilepsy and required isolated quiet. Newspapers minimized coverage. John became Britain's hidden prince, alive but erased. On January 18, 1919, following a severe seizure, John died at age 13. Queen Mary wrote to a friend that his death was a great release, the greatest mercy for that poor, little troubled soul. Those words, release and mercy, echo through centuries of royal correspondence, revealing a worldview where difference equaled unendurable suffering. Yet Lala Bill told a different story. She kept every drawing John made, every photograph, every small treasure he'd collected. John, she insisted, had been a happy child. He loved music and would clap along to phonograph recordings. He adored the estate's dogs. He experienced joy, affection, and contentment, the fundamental components of a meaningful life. None of that mattered to the palace. John was buried at Sandringham with minimal ceremony. No state funeral, no public mourning, just quiet interment that finally made official what had been true for years. The psychological consequences extended far beyond the hidden children themselves. Parents who might have loved their different offspring learned to see them as shameful secrets. Mothers particularly suffered. Royal women had one primary duty: producing heirs, and a disabled child represented catastrophic failure. Anne of Austria, Queen of France, who gave birth to an infant with Down syndrome in 1640, spiraled into depression. Her private letters reveal a woman consumed by guilt, desperately seeking explanation for why God had cursed her. When the infant died after 6 weeks, likely from heart defects, Anne's relief was palpable. Not relief at her child's death, but relief that the evidence of her failure had been removed. The unnamed infant was buried in an unmarked section of the Basilica of Saint-Denis without ceremony or memorial. Siblings grew up in strange emotional landscapes, told their brother or sister had died, yet hearing servants whisper about mysterious rooms and distant wings. These encounters shaped them profoundly. Edward VIII rarely spoke of his brother John in his memoirs. When he did, it was with clinical detachment, referring to John's condition as a family tragedy handled with appropriate discretion. No anger at injustice, no grief at the lost relationship, just acceptance that this was how things were done. The archives tell this story in fragments. A page torn from a baptismal register. A portrait painted but never displayed. Payment ledgers that don't quite match official rosters. Letters written in careful code by mothers who weren't allowed to speak their grief aloud. One of the most haunting artifacts survives in the Bavarian State Archives, a journal kept by Emma Müller, nurse to Prince Waldemar of Prussia, born 1889. Waldemar was hidden away like all the others, but Emma used her wages to commission a local artist to paint his portrait every year on his birthday. 17 portraits in total, showing a boy growing into a man. After Waldemar's death in 1906 at age 17, Emma tried to give these portraits to his mother. They were refused, burned in front of her. The last visual evidence of Waldemar's existence turned to ash. Emma spent her remaining years writing letters to newspapers, trying to tell his story, but no paper would publish them. Those letters paint a picture of a young man who loved trains, who could identify every bird by its song, who memorized entire orchestral pieces after hearing them once. He was not less than, she wrote repeatedly. He was different then, and different in God's eyes is not wrong. Even as late as the 1950s, these patterns persisted. Prince John of Luxembourg, born in 1957 with Down syndrome, represented a turning point, not because his family treated him well, but because they admitted he existed. The Luxembourg royal family acknowledged publicly that they had a son with developmental disabilities who lived in a specialized care facility. This admission was revolutionary precisely because it was so rare. Most European royal houses still clung to old protocols of denial and erasure. Modern prenatal testing has added another dimension to this history. Royal families can now detect Down syndrome before birth, leading to different but equally fraught moral choices. Some have almost certainly terminated pregnancies upon such diagnoses, adding another layer of absence to this centuries-long pattern. These hidden royals reveal how power perpetuates itself through shame, through the creation of categories of acceptable and unacceptable humanity. Every society creates such categories. Royal families simply made theirs explicit and hereditary. They remind us that the measure of any civilization lies not in its palaces or achievements, but in how it treats those who can't perform in prescribed ways, who exist outside the boundaries of useful difference. Somewhere across Europe, in unmarked graves and forgotten corners of royal crypts, lie the bones of princes and princesses whose only crime was being born different. Their names were scratched out, their faces destroyed, their existence denied. Yet they lived. They breathed and laughed and cried. They arranged colored glass in patterns, predicted weather, sang songs only they understood. They were fully human despite every effort to pretend otherwise. Picture one of them now. Any one of the dozens, perhaps hundreds, of royal children with Down syndrome hidden across 5 centuries. They sit in a tower room or convent cell, watching light move across ancient walls. They don't know about chromosomes or genetics, don't understand the political calculations that place them here. They only know that sunlight is warm, that certain sounds please them, that somewhere beyond these walls exists a world they'll never be allowed to enter. The attendant comes and goes in silence. The years pass unmarked, and history, official history, pretends they never existed at all. But they did. They do. And that has to be enough.